The first step in working with your stencils is going to be to weed it. So simply speaking, that means that you're going to remove the excess stencil material from the stencil sheet itself, exposing the stencils and making them easier to pull off and understand where you're going to go with your project. So the way I do it is I start from one of the sides. I will cut off pieces in this area so that I don't get too much going backwards, because you don't want the stencil laying back upon itself. And then I will keep pressure on the sheet itself as I lift it and straight up, and it will actually pull all of the pieces. As you can see, if I lift it straight up, it will pick up all of the nooks and crannies, and we'll get all of the detail that we need. But it's just a matter of pulling it off, taking the excess, tossing it aside, if it will go aside, and keeping going. So try not to do the whole sheet at one time in one foul swoop, because you'll end up with it leaking back on itself, sticking to the spots that you don't want it to stick in, and creating an issue for yourself. So the key to this is pulling it straight up in small sections and keeping pressure on the sheet. That will allow you to make sure that it all comes up at once and you don't end up grabbing any of the stencil material that you don't want to have. The trick is to take your time and keep pressure and lift as straight up as you possibly can. You can use your support hand in order to make sure that that happens. If you pull on too much of an angle, there's a high likelihood that you can disrupt where the actual stencils are sitting and arriving at a result that you're not looking for. If you get into a situation where things are not coming up the way you want, a pair of tweezers can be used in order to get into that small space and lift up the material that is being a bit tricky. We're nearly done. As you see, it doesn't take very long. At any rate, that's the completed weeding process. You can see all of the stencils here. There are voids in that which will come up when you are done, but what I would suggest is you take out the lettering from these stencils, the control stencils. It makes it easier when you apply it to the camera later. And that's it.
This is an overview of the stencil sheet. I've broken it down by color and the stage that they will be applied. Green being the base layer before you put down the first base layer of coating, the blue being the highlight layer, the purple being the next layer, and finally the controls and the masking are in red. The shapes marked optional are just that. They're for your use if you decide to do that. Things such as masking off the LED display to show that the camera is recording, or the power button. The yellow pieces are filler pieces, and they're used just in the masking process to exactly that, fill the gaps where there might be some overspray that comes in. Use them to plug any holes in your masking layer. The first step in the project is going to be preparing the unit with base layer stencils and sanding it down and cleaning it off. So we begin by removing the eye cup, which is friction fit and easily is displaced. Moving on, we take the stencils that would cover the serial number, the SiOnyx badge plate. Some of you may not care about that. I do on mine, so I've covered it off. The lens cover sits inside of the plastic. Take it, make sure that it's sitting just inside the plastic so you don't get any plastic coming through, especially on the supports where it's white plastic. You don't want that coming out on your finish. Sit it inside of the plastic on the glass. Rub around the edge to make sure that you get good adhesion and you won't get any leakage. Next one is the viewfinder. Same option here. place it inside of the plastic, push it down all the way around, make sure you've got a good adhesion and you will not get any overfill. Next one is the focus ring. So we take the piece and we look at one side or the other, doesn't matter, just outside of the nomenclature, the writing on the focus ring, place it on the metallic area and put it down. Make sure you get a good adhesion as well. Last, we've got the shutter button. You'll see that one side is rounded, the other side is straight. The rounded side goes up against the plastic, as you see in the video. Place it down and then use your fingernail to cup around the side of it. Next, we get to the sanding down of the metallic area so that we can get good adhesion with your paint, whether it's spray paint, Duracoat, Cerakote, it doesn't matter. Lightly sanded. I use a 220 grit paper here in order to make sure we get a nice roughing of the metallic area, which is quite slick otherwise. You'll get good adhesion this way. You don't need to make big grooves in it, and you certainly don't need to take all the metallic finish off, but you do need to scuff it up to make sure that the paint will stick. Go all the way around on all of those surfaces and make sure that you get a light sanding on everything. Don't leave anything without it. Inside of the area where the controls are, you'll see the LED light that gives you your power indicator. Make sure you don't sand over that unless you're planning on painting over it as well. There is one of the optional stencils in the kit that will sit over top of that. On my unit, it's quite small so that it doesn't illuminate too much. Once you're finished with the sanding, we move on to wiping it down with alcohol. This will remove any of the debris from the sanding, so you'll actually get a gold or green or bluish tinge on your paper towel from the metal filings that are coming off. But give it a good wipe down. If there's anything that's dirty or you sense anything that is oily, you want to make sure that you remove that. Moving into the base layer, being in this case with this color motif, it's black, so combat black with Duracoat, matte black with the Tamiya finish. We start with the eye cup, give it a thorough coating. Moving on to the camera itself. It's key here that when you're using the spray paint, as per the spray paint tutorial, keep the can at 8 to 10 inches away, and we've got quick, light presses of the spray can itself. We do not want to cake paint all over this thing. If you're using an airbrush, it's a lot easier to control that, but when you're using a spray can, it's just this quick spurts of spray paint from a reasonable distance, light coating. Please make sure to move the diopter wheel so that you get coating there, and the seam ring as well, so that you are covering all of the white of the plastic. I purchased a $10 cake decorating ring, which makes this process a whole lot easier for spinning around. Make sure that we get good coverage all the way around on that base layer. Now that the base layer is down, we're moving on to the highlighting stencils. So these stencils are the more intricate shapes. These are the blue ones on your sheet. Putting them down as you see fit along this. There's more than enough stencil material here to do the job. So you could do it any way you like. I cover it uniformly across the entire camera, but you don't want it to be too much. Less is more in many of these cases. When you're putting the stencils down, it's important to get them right into the nooks and crannies. You can use your fingernail. In this case, I'm using tweezers. To get them into the nooks and crannies, I find that an old room card from a hotel or a credit card is helpful for getting along flat edges so that you can get good adhesion and the stencils sit absolutely perfectly on the material itself, and we do not get any overspray, which will give us very crisp lines. This is what the project should look like when you're finished this stage. Some sort of uniform distribution of these highlighting pieces. They will pop when the base color is revealed after the stencils are removed. Moving on to the second coat, there will be two colors in the way that we've laid this down. In this case, we're using Gunship Gray and Olive for the Tamiya. I use a combination of Parker and Flat Dark Earth or Cav Arms OD Green in this case. Any of the olive greens will work with the Duracoat, any of the darker ones anyway. So in this case, what we're going to do is I spray, because I'm using the Duracoat, I spray the entire thing with the Parker, making sure I get good coverage. I want to make sure that I move the diopter wheel as well to get good coverage into there, and the scene wheel to make sure that I have coverage in that area as well. But I get a good covering here of the entire camera. You can use the stencils, as I said in the tutorial, to judge the thickness of the painting material that you're putting down. Less is more here. We don't want to cake paint all over this thing and lose all of the detail. Once that first coat is down, we bring in the highlight coat. So the highlight coat here really allows you to dictate what your project will look like. Light or dark will be dictated by how much of the dark color or the lighter color that you let reveal itself. So I typically cover about a 50-50 split unless the customers that have made a request for me to accentuate one color or the other. It's really important here that when you're using the spray paint that you're very careful about putting it down so that you don't overcover the actual item. But once again, less is more. So you can see now that as we move on to the large shapes, that you've got a good distribution of both colors. What will happen now as we apply the purple shapes on the sheet to cover up broader areas of the paint job, the reveal of those two-tone colors will come up everywhere that we place these larger stencils. Because erosion is made up of lakes and rivers from around the world, for the folks that are close to me in Ontario, I typically will lay the Great Lakes in a semblance of their actual shape and geography so that I can point to the spot where they live on the item before I cover it up. It's typically what I do when I take photographs of these things and send them to my customers when the work is in progress. Make sure that you get good adhesion, running your fingernails along, making sure that the edges of the stencils are firmly in place is always a good idea. I like to do this just before I paint each of the layers as well. You can see what these items look like with about a 50% coverage. So the final fill layer is NATO Black in this motif with the Tamiya, or a custom blend of Duracoat that I use. I use Combat Black for 8 parts, 2 parts white, and 1 part red to come up with the fill color that I use. But once again, we're going to paint the entire unit. Use the stencils as a judge for how much material that you've put on. Less is more. I keep saying that, but it's the truth. You want to make sure that you put on enough layer to get good coverage, but not so much that it's caked on and you start to lose the definition of the camera itself. Once that final base layer is down, we let it dry and then we remove all of the stencils except for that base layer, the green ones on the sheet. They are the only ones that remain on for this next part. We're going to apply the controls and the nomenclature stencils. You're going to want to have a steady hand here. Take your time because there is some precision involved in how you're going to place these down. I use a combination of tweezers and a modeling knife to achieve this, making sure that the stencils get properly into position. So the set button is very much centered on that button, and then this particular stencil will sit around the edges, making sure that we do not get any overspray. Moving on to the scene determinant. I've made this stencil the exact same shape as the outcropping on the item, so line up the edges and you will be in the appropriate spot to place this down. There are 2 ways to get these done where there's pieces in the middle. You can use a piece of transfer tape, or you can do what I've done in the video here is just leave them on the stencil sheet, then grab them up and by hand place them in the middle, making sure that you press them down to get good adhesion. Make sure that you center the scene wheel so that the outcropping is actually centered on your camera. Once you've centered that scene button, the scene indicator will sit perfectly onto that, and you'll be able to see exactly where this is going to sit because the notch will fit perfectly within the stencil. On the focus ring, you're going to find that there is one ribbing that is twice as wide as all the others. That's where this particular stencil goes. And then the wider band sits over top of that, wrapping all the way around, making sure that you've got a good fit and it will avoid any overspray. The off stencil sits just above the ridge that sits on top of the control wheel. The bottom of the stencil is just above the seam in the camera itself. Once again, the center of the O I place in later rather than using transfer tape. Make sure that the control dial is turned to the off position before you place this stencil, and the dot that will indicate where the off is vertical. Moving on to the control stencils. Here's where, if you're not comfortable with it, you might want to use some transfer tape. Care is needed here because of the exact location of this particular stencil. I've lined up the edge of the stencil with the natural ridge on the camera itself, and you will cozy up the arc in the stencil to the dial on the particular camera. Once you have it appropriately in position, you want to make sure that you get a good adhesion all the way around. If you were using the transfer tape, you'd take the tape off now, but what I do is place the dots into the camera and the settings cog as well as the play button. You can see here what those stencils will look like. In my case, I had my logo on the side that I put on. These pieces will fit cozying up to that dial from the other side. I find it easier to kind of bend this and put it in place. These pieces are custom fit, sitting on top, and at the bottom of the control, you'll see that it just will match up with all of the edges. Next, we're going to use the dial piece. There is a notch in it that lines up with the dot at the top. Takes a little bit of care to put that around, but it is a custom fit. Make sure it sits down onto the other material and move it around gradually until you get it into the right position, and then start to depress. It's important that you keep it down near the baseline stencil material as you move it around. Once you have it in place, you can fold it over onto itself and it will adhere. What I find here is that some of the optional fill pieces can go around the top to make sure that we get a good seal. Right beside that long strip was a strip of a similar size that is notched into little squares. Using those, we can get into the pieces beside that make up the crevice next to the wheel and the flat part of the camera, ensuring that no overspray comes into play. Now that that's done, we look at the larger piece. This piece sits over top of all of the others. You line it up, it should be parallel with the sides. Make sure that the tab on the scene indicator sits underneath the tongue on the piece, and it will all fit into place. Make sure you press it down. Once again, we're making sure we have a good seal to avoid any overspray. In this case, we're using a piece of transfer tape in order to pull the stencil off. This is the erosion logo that I placed on this particular camera. If you are going to have your own logo on the side, that's an option for this spot as well. There's also a piece that you can use to mask it off. Larger piece sits alongside of the first top cover. There's a notch in it that goes inside of the area just beside the control wheel, and make sure that everything's lined up, wrap it around, and seal it off. Once again, this is the spot where all those little fill pieces, the rectangles on the sheet, come into play to fill any gaps or holes that are left. What we're aiming for is complete and entire coverage and a seal around the entire area. You can see here how I'm using some of the rectangular pieces to fill any holes. Last piece would be over the viewfinder, square it up, and then wrap it down. You're going to get a complete seal of the camera itself. Go over all of the seals and the seams to make sure that everything is adhered properly. The last stage is the controls. For the Duracoat, I use Coyote Brown. On the Tamiya, I use TS90, which is Japanese Ground Defense Force color. A very light coat is all you need here in order to get the proper effect. I don't spray it too close under a lot of pressure, just in case there is any adhesion issues around the edges. There shouldn't be, but if you didn't press it down, it's possible. So make sure that you don't blast your material underneath. I find spraying it at a right angle also helps ensure that we get no overspray. So now it's time to see what our project looks like. So we take off all of the stencil material. When you're removing the stencil material, you can use that same modeling knife, but be very careful not to scratch the material that is underneath the stencil. Pick at an edge, be very careful with it. Once all the stencils are removed, except for the green layer, the base layer of stencils, I apply 3 to 4 coats of automotive clear coat to the project. Then this is what your project will look like when you're done.